In some ways, life is extremely complicated. And the more we look into it, like from the scientific angle, say in cosmology or quantum physics or organic chemistry, the more complicated we discover it is. So, for example, in the study of just say a single living cell, right, that used to be thought of as this very simple organism, and then as more study was done, as the equipment enabled people to see more of the detail, they realized, wow, these are extremely complex. These are comparable to small cities with various machines in operation. And likewise with study of the cosmos, deep space, as scientists look more, they find more mystery, basically, right? In some ways, you could say our understanding is growing, but the world in a physical sense is certainly an extremely complicated place, right? The study of the origin of life, for example, an extremely complicated um, field of study, right? That some people try to simplify, but whenever they do so and claim that they've basically recreated the spontaneous forming of life in the laboratory, it turns out that that's not the case, that they're actually having to purchase portions of the material intact, ready to go. And even then, it's not successful in producing the complexity of life that we see. So I say all that to contrast the moral reality, which actually is not at all complicated. It could be stated in just a couple sentences, and it's not deeper than those sentences. It's not, infinitely more complex. The more you look into it, it just stays the same. The simple truth stays the same forever. So, um, Yeshua the Messiah, also known as Jesus Christ, said that the entire moral law could be summed up in what he called the greatest commandments. And he said that was to love God, to love others, and to love yourself. I'm simplifying the words, but that is basically what he said: to love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love others as yourself is the exact quote. But it's correct to say that it's a law of comprehensive love, right? It's love towards God, it's love towards others, and it's love towards yourself. So it's comprehensive. It's love that includes everyone you could be loving towards, right? In our reality, you could say there's three actors, so to speak, three beings, three categories of being that you can express love toward, and that would be divinity, others meaning other people and other sentient creatures like animals, and then yourself. So if you're being loving towards all three, then you're fulfilling the moral law. And that's the truth. Like, it's not, it was actually the truth before Yeshua of Nazareth in the area we now know is like the Middle East or Palestine around 2000 and 20 years ago. Before he spoke those words, it was true, and it continues to be true today, thousands of years later, and it will continue on like that forever. So it's a simple eternal truth on morality. one key element of it, or one key perspective on it, that should be simple to understand but has been confused, is what is the opposite of love? And therefore, what is a violation of the law, right? Because if you're doing the exact opposite of what the law is telling you to do, then you're violating the law. So I hope you can follow me on that logic there, right? Like that's a law of logic, that something is not its opposite, right? It is what it is, and it's not its opposite. They can't coexist. So if the law is to love, then it's simultaneously a law against doing the complete opposite. And a lot of people will initially think, well, the opposite of love is hate. But that's actually incorrect. That's not the kind of love he was talking about. He wasn't talking about love as in something that you really, really like. You know, like, oh, I love that car, but I hate that car, right? You're not breaking the greatest commandments of the Messiah if you really don't like a particular style of car or a particular style of clothing or a type of food or on and on and on. To have extreme dislike for something isn't an immoral act. So what is the violation, right? Well, he's talking about love as in loving action, right? Showing loving kindness, care, generosity, right? Honesty, showing loving action toward another being, right? So what's the opposite of that? He's not talking about what you really like or what you really dislike, right? He's talking about the verb of love, which is, like I said, a loving action. It's abuse. The opposite of that is abuse. Okay, so what is abuse? Well, it comes in three forms. Aggression, known as, or defined as here, defined correctly in this context as the initiation of violence, which is not at all the same as defensive force. So just make that real clear real quick. If someone, let's actually use the example that Jesus gave, which has been purposely mistranslated. So he said, if someone slaps you on one cheek or jaw, right? The translation that we have, the popular translation, is that he says to turn to them the other cheek, as if you're inviting them to hit your other cheek. That's not what he said. They purposely mistranslated the words. He said, return to them one of the same kind likewise. And this fits the context of his ministry, where he explained that he didn't come to abolish the moral law, but to fulfill it and refine it. Many Christians, when they hear the word fulfill, they think, oh, well, he fulfilled the law by accepting the crucifixion, and that was a blood payment for all of our sins, and so that fulfilled the law. But that's also not what he meant, and that's also not what the crucifixion was about. I'll link to further explanation on that below, but that's what the false apostle Paul taught, and the false state Roman Empire church that was, as him being the champion, and continuing to this day as a hijacking of the true ministry of Jesus. But without going on too much of a tangent there, return to this basic moral law, because I actually wanted to talk about things like electric cars and gas stoves, believe it or not. So I'm working my way to that. And it'll actually make sense as to why that's something to talk about. So the true moral law, you could say, is a law of comprehensive love, or you could also say it's a law against abuse, or in other words, a non-abuse principle, the non-abuse principle, meaning abuse is never acceptable, period, in any scenario, in any time, in any place. Doesn't matter if there's a hurricane coming, it doesn't matter if there's a war going on, it doesn't matter if the market just crashed, it doesn't matter what the external circumstances are. Abuse is never actually ethically legitimate. So the three forms of abuse are, again, aggression, the initiation of violence, which again is not defensive force, because defensive force is actually an act of love. You're acting against abuse. You're defending either yourself or others who are being abused. That's actually an act of love. So to think that defensive force is bad is completely wrong. It's 100% backwards. It's not at all. Defensive force is an act of love. So pacifism basically is a mistaken ethical worldview, largely based on that one mistranslation, that purposeful mistranslation of Jesus, along with other authors who have, taken that idea and run with it into, a wilderness of irrationality. There's amazing authors like Leo Tolstoy who wrote great books like The Kingdom of God is Within You, but the portions of the book that fall off the rationality and intelligence cliff are the portions in which he's trying to make sense of pacifism, where he's trying to defend the position which he thinks is Jesus's position, but actually isn't and wasn't. It's just the position of the people that purposely mistranslated his words. So, no aggression, no deception, and no stealing. If you do an analysis of your life and the world, you'll see that it's always those three that are actually the immoral acts, the abusive acts, that either we ourselves can commit or that we observe others commit. So that's the simple moral law, right? So again, we live in this extremely complex universe, right? We are in control of these immensely complex human bodies, which we can't even begin to understand really how they work so well, despite all of the toxins we're exposed to and radiation and lack of sleep and lack of sunlight and so on and so forth, which is getting ahead of myself again here, but we live in an amazing creation that is incredibly complex, but within that amazingly physically, materially complex universe, there exists a moral fabric which is based on a moral law, which is extremely simple, and which is as I just described, as I just explained. So then, why has the world been such a unpleasant place for such a long time, and why is it beginning increasingly unpleasant? Well, it's not because it was designed to be that way, right? If you think about, well, what does it take to have a pleasant life? Well, you need the basics of survival, right? So you need food, you need shelter, you need clean water, right? These are all actually provided by the earth, right? By creation, right? The seeds of the fruits and the vegetables and trees, right? They are all pre-existing in nature, and they all multiply freely. We don't have to, pay money for the apple seed to grow. It just does that, and then it produces another apple tree with, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of more apples, each containing more seeds, and you can just continue on like that, generation after generation, right? Which is what, of course, people have been doing. Same with water, right? We use water, but it comes back around. We have the water cycle, right? It doesn't leave us, and we don't have to, pay the creator or anyone else for it. It's pre-existing in nature, here for our use and survival. Same with the land. As long as you're not overtaxing the land, it can actually become increasingly fertile year after year as you fertilize it and, grow your orchard and vegetables and grains on that land. So the basics for survival, right, to prevent the suffering of, um, dehydration or starvation, exists for us. They're pre-existing for free. And then, of course, shelter from the elements. Well, the natural resources we need for that also are pre-existing and free in nature, right? Whether it's, you know, hemp that you use for building material, or stone, or wood, straw bale, clay, right? All these natural materials that have been used for buildings and homes for centuries, right? Pre-existing in nature, free of charge, from the creator. Even if you don't believe in the creator, you'd have to agree that they're pre-existing in nature, and you know available to everyone where they should be, right? So that's where we get into the morality problem, and why the world isn't as it should be, and why it's been getting increasingly worse and more abusive, more totalitarian. So the reason why it's gotten so bad so many times, on a large scale, and why it continues to do so repeatedly, the main reason is because people think there are either A, exceptions to the moral law, or they think the moral law is not being violated when actually it is. So, a fundamental form of this confusion, or a fundamental example, a key example of this moral confusion, which has supported untold destruction and misery and violence for centuries, is the issue of taxation. And this is actually something that also uh, Jesus is misrepresented concerning, right? So in the Gospels, you'll read that he was asked, should we, he was just basically asked point blank, should we pay taxes or not? And the answer he gave, and in the context, you have to also recognize that they were trying to get him arrested, and he wasn't wanting to be arrested just at that time. He still wanted to continue his ministry. He was still following the timeline that his heavenly Father was giving him, right? But uh, to not go off on too much of a Christian um, tangent here, the issue of taxation, right? When he was asked, he gave a, you could say, ambiguous answer, right? He said, well, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. So, he asked to see a coin, and he said, whose face is that on the coin? And said, oh, that's Caesar. And he said, oh, okay, well, if that's Caesar's coin, he's got his face printed on it, apparently it's his property. So give it back to him, but give back to Caesar, give back to Caesar what belongs to him, but give back to God what belongs to him. And of course, the Empire Church would want you to believe that that is equivalent with him saying, all governments are legitimate for all time and are inspired by God and desired by God, and obedience to them is equal to obedience to God, which is a major false equivalency, right? Like, it's just not fair at all to say that what he said is equivalent to that. What it is equivalent to is what the false apostle Paul said, right? So he did actually say words just like I just said, where obeying the government is equal to obeying God, and that they're ordained by God and necessary and good. And he even said slaves need to obey their masters, even if they're abusive masters, because that's also pleasing to God. Of course, false. So this one man, the so-called apostle Paul, basically um, hijacked and misdirected um, the entire Christian world by getting them to think that abuse wasn't always bad. Because even though it would be bad to coerce your neighbor to pay you money for things that you didn't sign a contract for directly, even though that would be abusive, it's not abusive when they do it because they're holy, right? Because this guy Paul said so, right? It's just really disappointing to see like the lack of analysis, right? Because when you look at it, it's just so obviously bunk. So why is that? Why are people so good at analyzing certain things, but when it comes to like these key moral issues, they are very weak at it, or give little to no effort whatsoever, and basically just accept whatever they've been told by the so-called authorities? Well, that's because they're naive concerning these authorities. And so then the question is, well, why are they so naive concerning them? Why are they so immediately trusting, even though all of history shows that they're not trustworthy? And even though we can see them carry out abusive and deceptive acts on a regular basis, why is it that people then still think that they are somehow the most trustworthy and should be given this special right to be abusive in ways that would be criminal for you or I to engage in? Well, that's because people have been programmed, right? So I'll go off on another major example of moral confusion, which has led to huge amounts of abuse, and that's humans' relationship towards animals. So it's another one where if you actually look into the truth about Jesus and don't just trust what the so-called like authorized version of this one compilation of letters and books says about him, you'll discover that he, along with entire Jewish communities of his time, abstained from eating animal flesh and actually spoke directly against it. And this was actually part of the main division between the true 12 apostles and Paul, which we just get in this watered down, distorted version, in the modern authorized writings, where they're talking about whether eating meat sacrificed to idols is acceptable or not. And Paul's basically saying it's okay, and the apostles of Jesus are saying no, it's not. But it goes even deeper than that. It was actually a complete um, discontinuance of the eating of flesh, if they ever did at all. And you can find historical reference very easily. James, the brother of Jesus, was raised vegetarian. And so then you would have to ask yourself, well, if his parents raised him vegetarian, why would they raise his brother not? So the information is there to be discovered in books like The Lost Religion of Jesus and another book called Disciples, both by the same author, Keith Akers. And also I have other talks that link to more information. So I bring up the issue of carnism, or the human predatory stance towards animals as a huge example of how people have been programmed to accept abuse, because not only what is it not God's intent for us, as made clear in the first page of the Bible, Genesis 1:29, saying that all plants are here for our food. But you can also just observe a young child and see how they don't have a carnivorous instinct. If you give them some grapes and then a bunny rabbit, they're gonna eat the grapes, and they're gonna love on the little bunny rabbit. They're gonna pet the rabbit and become friends with the rabbit, right? They're not interested in killing the rabbit and eating its flesh, eating his or her flesh. Likewise, if there's roadkill on the side of the road, a child isn't going to be like yanking on their parents' shirt and telling them to pull over so that they can, eat the dead flesh on the side of the road, right? Quite the opposite. They're going to be grossed out by it, right? So you might find this to be, I don't know, you might call this anecdotal evidence, but it's just pointing out the reality that humans aren't instinctually aggressive towards animals. They have to actually be programmed that way. And even with that programming, because we're not designed to be abusive, right? Because we're made in the imagination and likeness of God. So that moral law is actually part of our being, known as our conscience, right? That's why it's kept out of sight, right? Most people don't want to see what goes on in a slaughterhouse, and they don't want to, murder the chicken or the lamb or the pig themselves. They just rather that be kind of out of sight, out of mind, and I'll just, buy the pieces of flesh in the supermarket. So, billions and billions and billions of animals go through massive suffering and are, enslaved and murdered every year. And that's just considered okay because people have been programmed to believe it's okay. So, what is this programming and where is it coming from? Well, it's coming from what we call the enemy of humanity, the enemy of the Creator, who is purely evil. And so, the Creator being perfectly good, in other words, loving, is opposed by a being that's the complete opposite, right? So, completely abusive, right? Completely evil is equivalent with saying completely abusive. And so, the goal of the enemy is to deceive humanity into being abusive rather than loving. And this is actually illustrated in again, going back to the very first pages of the Bible, the story, which of course has been distorted, but the elements of truth are still there to be put together. You have the knowledge of good and evil. There's a tree called the knowledge of good and evil. The fruit on the tree contains this knowledge of good and evil. And then you have the enemy, you have the devil, represented by the snake, on that tree. And so what that actually meant, or, what that actually is representing, is that he was corrupting the knowledge of good and evil. And so if you eat of that corrupted knowledge, it'll lead to your downfall, right? And this was actually, you can still piece together the truth, despite all the distortion, by taking note of what Adam and Eve did immediately after eating the fruit that was corrupted knowledge of good and evil. They became ashamed of their naked bodies, right? So why is that significant? Because the naked body in and of itself is not a bad thing. There's absolutely nothing wrong with just a naked human body. So they became confused. Their sense of right and wrong became immediately confused, and they then thought that, oh, my nakedness is bad, right? And so that was illustrated by their immediate change of perspective on their natural state, and scurrying about trying to find leaves. I don't know if they were scurrying, but they immediately went, for the fig leaf or whatever to cover themselves, right? So the story still has the elements of truth there, where because of a distorted knowledge of good and evil being followed, right? They believed the lies of the devil. Lies about what? Lies about what's good and bad, what's true and false, in a moral sense. That led to their downfall, right? And so that's the same story. That nothing has changed. That's the exact same reason why humanity continues to go in this degraded direction, because people are believing a false morality, a backwards morality. And what that means specifically is that they are thinking that sometimes abuse is okay. And what's actually abuse is actually something good, right? So, circling back to taxation, right? If you think taxation is okay, the only reason you would think that and believe that is because you haven't really thought about it very carefully, because it's clearly not. And the reason why so many voluntarists, libertarians, anarchists have, you know, come up, come to this conclusion for centuries, by the way, it's not like a new idea, is because they recognize, well, it would be wrong for me to do this to my neighbor, so how is it suddenly made okay because these other people, part of this organization, which is basically a large gang that commits extortion and mass murder on a regular basis, why is it okay for them to do it? And this is where the moral confusion comes in, backed by logical fallacies, right? Because those extortionists will tell you, oh, no, it's not extortion. It's, doing your part for the community, right? It's actually being generous and looking out for the common good, right? So people buy that lie and then perpetuate the abuse, right? And so they get richer and richer off the extortion and more powerful, and they're able to do more and more destructive things on a bigger and bigger scale, right? Atomic weapons would have never come into being without taxation, without government. The horror that was put on the people of Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? That would have never actually happened if there wasn't this whole system of extortion going on in the first place. And of course, countless other examples of atrocities of mass murder, right? Vietnam, the estimate is, well over 1 million, close to 2 million Vietnamese were killed. Or how many of those were women and children, right? In Iraq, Afghanistan more recently. I mean, the examples of innocent people being maimed and killed in war are endless, right? And how many of these wars were made possible by taxation? Probably all of them, right? Definitely the majority of them, if not 99.9% of them, right? So let's just ignore that, right? Is what modern civilized, academia and establishment, you know, education would want you to believe is the intelligent perspective. Oh, never mind all that, because it's actually just a minor side effect of this greater good, which is being produced by this acceptance of abuse on a mass scale on a daily basis. So this also leads directly to a key understanding on independence, right? It's really ironic that still in the United States, the Declaration of Independence is recognized as a very important document that was not only, you know, foundational for the people of this region for generations, but also, inspirational to people all around the world. And what is that document basically saying? It's saying this relationship that we have, they're talking, to the British Empire, to the King George there. We we find this relationship abusive, and so we no longer want to continue it. We want to break up. We want you to just leave us alone. It wasn't a declaration that, hey, we're going to invade England. No. It was saying, we want independence. We want you to go away, leave us alone. I mean, you can hang out with us as long as you're not abusive, right? It was a declaration of independence from abuse, right? It was a list of all of these offenses, right? All of these acts of violence, all of these injustices, and they're saying we don't want to continue this any longer, right? So it's basically just saying we want to end this relationship. We found this relationship abusive. We want to end it. Now, if you were to look at that on a small scale, just say between, two people, if one person said to another person, you know what, I don't think this relationship is healthy anymore. I find that your, repeated abuses are just unacceptable. And so I just want to leave, right? I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to do anything abusive to you. I just want to end the relationship, right? If you ask most people, is that legitimate? I think it's safe to say probably everyone would say, if not 99.999% would say, yeah, of course that's legitimate. If you don't want to be in a relationship, it doesn't make sense that you should be forced to be in it, right? So this is just like common basic ethics, right? But then again, they think, oh, well, that doesn't apply to a relationship with governments. It's different. Something's changed, the magic spell has been cast, and now basic morality doesn't really hold true anymore. The non-abuse principle doesn't hold true anymore. And actually, if you want to declare independence like those original colonists did, if you wanted to do that today, that wouldn't actually be legitimate. Say you're, living in a small town, real small town, like everybody knows each other, and everyone's just doing normal things, going to work, farming, working at a hardware store or whatever, you know, and then this bigger organization known as the federal government starts imposing, let's say, medical tyranny on them, starts saying that they want to inject them with various pharmaceuticals, and they won't even disclose what the ingredients are. And, if they injure or kill you, well, sorry, you know, you can't actually sue us or the company for that damage to you and your children. And so let's imagine the members of this small town are like, you know what? We don't like this, We don't like you saying that we have to just inject ourselves and our children with whatever pharmaceutical cocktails you come up with. We find that abusive. And so we want to end the relationship that we have with you. And, you know, for this reason and a bunch of other reasons, actually, we don't like what you've been doing with our tax dollars and other ways. You know what? We just want you to leave us alone, and we're just going to continue on. We'll continue on with our um, sheriff department, but we'll just pay them privately, and we'll continue on with our fire and police and hospital, but we'll just pay for it all, locally. We don't need you to be involved in any way. We'll basically just privatize everything here, and we just want you to leave us alone. If a town did that today, right, they'd be labeled as like dangerous extremists, right, and they would be said to be selfish and wrong, right? So because of the context of the programming, where people believe that the ruling class are basically an exception to the rule, and somehow nonsensically, it's I can't even really understand it myself, even when I've thought about it for a while, because on one hand it's like thinking that these people must be angelic. But then on the other hand, it's saying, and because they're angelic, they have the right to do abusive things that normal people don't. But then my next question, of course, is, well, angels aren't abusive, so why are you connecting like their supposed divinity with a right to abuse, right? Like it doesn't make any sense on any level. Like why you would think they're angelic in the first place makes no sense, and then why you would think that that special class of people then have these special rights to do abusive things that are criminal for us to do also makes zero sense. And it's just the same with, why would you unnecessarily enslave, torture, and kill an animal when you don't have to, since they're sentient, have feelings, and want to live. There's no good reason, right? It's just programming. It's just like, oh no, that's what we need to do. We need to kill and eat animals. Oh no, we need to have government, right? It's just this brainwashed response that is very shallow and lacks any like real deep critical thinking. So another big part of the philosophical overview of why the world is the way it is recognizing the parallel between in psychology who are called the group of people diagnosed as covert narcissists, and actually is a triple parallel. So when you look at the behavioral traits of that group of people, and you look at the behavioral traits of people in power, particularly political power, you'll find that there's a lot of similarity, if not, just identical traits. And also, if you look into, if you've dealt with someone who they call a narcissist, which I would say is a misnomer, but I'll just use the term because that's the popular term right now for describing this particular abusive kind of person. And that's fundamentally what they are. They're just habitually abusive and deceptive. Deception being a form of abuse, but they're habitually aggressive and deceptive in a sneaky kind of way, right? Covert narcissism, meaning like they're doing it in a sneaky or underhanded way. And why would they do it that way? Well, because they didn't, they probably wouldn't get to continue doing what they're doing, right? So if you're an abuser and you want to get away with abuse, you don't want to do it too openly, right? You either need to um, do it in a subtle way that's hard to pinpoint and, you know, um, identify openly, pointing out to other people, or you want to convince people that, what they're doing isn't actually bad. And one of the main tactics that these toxic personalities or covert narcissists will use is guilt tripping. And that's exactly what governments use. They'll say that you're selfish and you should feel guilty for not wanting to supposedly pay your fair share to them, for them to then use wisely and benevolently, only for good, and never lacking in any intelligence or rationality whatsoever. Also, a very common characteristic of narcissists is that they project psychological projection. They tell the people or the person that they're abusing that they have the characteristics that they themselves have, right? So that you see this from government all the time. They call people dangerous when who want to be left alone, when it's in fact they who are the real danger to society and the world at large. And a lot of people too don't really get how progressively worse things are getting, also because they can get into a kind of comfortable state, and it's that slowly boiling the frog kind of thing, where people's rights are just being restricted or violated, more and more and more. Totalitarianism is just growing more and more and more. and they just kind of keep going along, going along, going along until it finally, shows its full face in something like these lockdowns, right? Oh, it's like I thought I could just ignore these political parasites, but now look, they've closed my business and they want to, inject me with dangerous substances and do the same to my children. And, they want to disarm everybody. And um, just to get real specific here, like a particular example, the governor of Maine just declared it's now legal for schools to administer sex altering chemicals, hormones to children without their parents' permission, right? So, I mean, the world is like literally becoming this uh, dystopia nightmare, step by step, bit by bit. Um, but people are just going along the whole time saying, well, we can't stop funding the establishment and these institutions that are actually, behind the worst of all of what's going on because we need them to be safe. And, in the relationship dynamic, what narcissists will oftentimes do is what's called gaslighting their victim, the person they're targeting. They'll try and make the person think they don't really know what they're talking about. They're not really being harmed, they're just being overly sensitive, And so it's the same with folks that are upset about the, disarmament of the population going on and saying, this is tyrannical. And people say, oh, what are you, a gun nut? Like you're way too sensitive about this. This is all just reasonable restrictions to keep everyone safe, right? Meanwhile, they're increasingly disarming nonviolent people so that they can then gain more power and be more abusive in the future. But people don't see it that way, even though that's the obvious historical pattern. Again, because they're naive, and again, the reason they're naive is because they were programmed to be idol worshiping, naive idiots, basically. So people just try and keep ignoring it and just live the life as best they can, and um, think like, well, it'll hopefully sort itself out, kind of thing. But that's not the way it works, and that's not the way it works with narcissists in a personal relationship too. And that's why any good counselor will tell you that if you are in a relationship with someone like that, there's the best mindset to have, the best strategy to have is just an exit strategy. You shouldn't try to fix them. You shouldn't try and, you know, think that it's just something you can change or, make better by improving yourself more. These people are chronically abusive in a deranged way, and they don't ever stop. And that's why I've come to realize that people in these positions of political power are just narcissists with that power. That's all it is. They're the same kind of people, but in positions of political power. And so the same solution applies, which is what they call no contact in, psychology or therapy, or coaching on these matters. They'll say you need to go no contact. So then this takes us back around to the issue of independence, right? Because that's what independence is, right? That's what secession is. It's saying, I don't want to be involved with you anymore. I want to end the relationship. And then the abuser saying, no, you can't end it, right? So even in smaller scale, we have, some states saying that they want to change where the border is because they don't agree with how they're being, um, governed by folks on the other side of the state. Or you have whole states like Texas saying, we want to secede again. Um, and then other people saying, no, no, you can't do that. And you're bad for even suggesting the idea. Selfish being a top uh, form of slander, right? Which, not coincidentally, is also what narcissists will use in a personal relationship. they'll gaslight and slander and project on the person they're abusing, calling them selfish, only because that person, you know, in this at this stage of the relationship, even at that stage of the relationship, if they say they want to leave, they would be slandered some more for that. So the same solution applies, but it's not given as an option, right? And so that's how you know that they really are wicked in intent and nature, because they don't want you to just go your own way if you want to go your own way. If a small town wanted to do the independence thing along with a bunch of other small towns and could form a voluntary community or region that way, right? They'd say, no, you can't do that. It's illegal. It's criminal. You're bad, right? If you want to end the relationship, you're not allowed to, right? So that's the fundamental ethical truth that takes the mask off of their supposed benevolence. And as a little history side note factoid for you, we're programmed, we're educated, quote unquote, that the Civil War in the United States was all about just slavery. It was just these northern folks that were, benevolent anti-slavery guys, and then you have these, evil slavery, pro-slavery folks in the South, and the North is like, you better end slavery, and then the South is like, no, we are never going to end slavery, and so then war, and that, that's basically the gist of the story that kids are told in school, and it's just completely false, right? Because the southern states actually peacefully seceded, declared independence from the United States, right? So they became an independent country peacefully. They didn't invade the North, they didn't storm the Capitol or do anything like that. They just said, it's over. We don't like this relationship, it's over, right? So they seceded or declared independence, right? Similar to how the colonists declared independence from Great Britain, right? And then Lincoln and the other Union leaders there actually that offered them what was called the Corwin Amendment, Corwin, which was going to be the 13th Amendment, that actually promised and guaranteed them to have unobstructed continuation of their institution of slavery indefinitely. So they actually said, if you will come back to the Union, you can keep the slavery operation going on. And then on top of that, you can find Lincoln quoted directly in the New York newspaper saying, if I could preserve the Union and, not free any of the slaves, if I would do so. If I could preserve the Union and free the slaves, I would do so. My main priority is just to preserve the Union. He made it very clear, but of course you weren't really probably taught this, that his main priority was preserving the Union, not abolishing slavery. And this is also made clear by the fact that the northern states also had slaves, and the Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually free the slaves in the North. It said that it only freed the slaves in the region where there is rebellion against the United States. So it was only saying that we proclaim that this other country that is now independent from us must free their slaves, but we're not going to free our own. And people think that that was this great declaration against slavery, which is ridiculous. If you actually just read it for yourself, you can see that what you were programmed to believe is false. Same with the 13th Amendment, as it finally did get passed, right? You just programmed to think, oh, well, it just freed all the slaves, it just ended slavery. That's it. If you actually read it, what does it say? It says slavery is abolished unless you're convicted of a crime. Minor detail, maybe. I mean, you just have to be like willfully ignorant to just ignore something like that, unless you're convicted of a crime. Well, guess what were crimes back then, right? Like, if an African American like looked at a white person the wrong way, right? They get arrested. So guess what? Back to the plantation, back to the chain gang, right? And that's what happened, right? Unless you're convicted of a crime. So slavery is an evil unless the government comes up with a law, makes up a law, and thereby makes you a criminal. For example, say they tell you, oh well, if you try and secede, if you try and become independent, that's criminal. So we get to enslave you for wanting to be left alone, right? Or oh, you want to take a certain medicinal plant? Oh, you're a criminal, even though you're not harming anyone else. So slavery, according to the 13th Amendment, is legit for you. We can throw you in prison and enslave you for the rest of your life, right? According to the 13th Amendment, it's fine. So another great example of not only how people have been deceived and programmed to think their benevolent overlords, are actually, benevolent and not just an abusive ruling class, which they are. But again, it's just a repeat of the original, you could say original sin, which isn't anything other than believing nonsense that backs a false morality, right? So, oh, all these abuses are okay if some so-called authority says so, right? The snake in the tree told me, so I'm just gonna go with that nonsense. And guess what, right? It led to the loss of paradise. And so that's just continued on. And now we live in an extremely physically toxic world, right? Narcissistic relationship, they call that a toxic relationship. If you live in a home with a toxic, with a narcissist, right, they call that a toxic home environment. If you have a narcissist in the workplace, they say it's a toxic work environment, right? Well, the whole world is toxic because it's run by narcissists, right? They say that narcissists just make about 10% of the population. And earlier I said it's a misnomer. I think a more accurate, calling them toxic would be closer to the truth. Just calling them evil, just saying that they're straight evil. They've just become habitually abusive. Uh, some theorize that they've somehow sold their soul to the devil and become, permanently or perfectly demon possessed. That sounds reasonable to me because, yeah, why else would you lose your born with conscience and just become habitually evil if not because you've become, completely overtaken by some evil spirit? That to me seems very reasonable indeed. So it's estimated that there's just about 10% of the population are these really evil people. But the percentage of those in positions of power is more like 95%, right? They're only 10% of the whole total global population, but they're like the vast majority of those in power. And that would make sense, right? Because if you were someone who was habitually abusive and wanted to get away with it, what better way to do so and to do it on a larger scale than to, you know, get into political power? Because then there's the supposed legitimacy of what you're doing that protects you, and you can wreak havoc on a much larger scale. You can be abusive on a much larger scale. So of course it would attract narcissists. It would attract evil people, and that's exactly what it's done. And that's why the main argument against anarchism is just so foolish. Like, it's just so stupid, right? They say, well, there's bad people in the world, so we need this institution to protect us from the bad people, right? That makes zero sense because you're assuming that bad people won't get into those positions of power. And additionally, if what you're trying to prevent is abuse, giving a special, creating this institution where people have the right to abuse, right, where it's legitimized abuse, how is that in any way making the world better? How are you in any way reducing the amount of abuse, right, which would be synonymous with safety, right? People are continually buying their line that they're keeping us safe, right? If you're being abusively controlled, that's the opposite of safety. So it's just a huge deception. that again can be simplified as deceiving you into believing there are exceptions to the non-abuse principle. And that's why the world keeps getting more and more toxic, right? I mean, it's just horrible. The cancer rates, autism, all these other disorders, Alzheimer's, are just, on these exponential curves, but everyone's like, oh, everything's just fine. It's just, I don't know what's really going on, but, we just got to keep paying our taxes and, listening to the experts on TV. And, it's just lemmings walking off towards the edge of the cliff, all because they can't just stick with basic morality and common sense and can't imagine a world of sovereign individuals that cooperate voluntarily and have access to a little bit of land and water and seed, getting back to the survival necessities provided for free by the Creator, provided for free on the earth here. Why is it so hard to fathom that we could have a fair society where a true social justice, where everyone had their own space for their own home and garden and orchard, and they could cooperate and volunteer and be sociable with others without creating this abusive ruling class of extortionists? Like, it's really crazy to think that this is somehow necessary and good when it doesn't make sense on paper, just looking at the ethics and logic direct, and it doesn't make sense when you look at the results, which have been horrific and continue to be horrific. But people have been programmed so strongly to be these naive idol worshippers that they'll, unfortunately, a lot of them seem like they'll just cling to it till the end. It could be a nuclear holocaust, but they'll say, well, you know, at least I was a good citizen, right? At least I paid my taxes. I don't, we did the best we could. I guess this was just inevitable. It's not inevitable. It just becomes inevitable if you empower abusive people, right? If you don't use defensive force against abusive people and you let them guilt trip you and gaslight you and project on you and convince you that, oh, it's not really abuse, or it's okay if they do the abuse, but you can't do it yourself, right? That backwards, confused morality is just the basis of this whole downfall of humanity, and that's what needs to be corrected. And just to finish my thought on electric cars and gas stoves that I mentioned earlier, and also to give a little extra clarity on the programming that I was talking about, or the brainwashing, I went into talking about how this is not just a modern phenomenon, right? That it's been going on for a long time, but it is, of course, worthy of mention how the programming has been, um, you could say, accelerated and refined and expanded on with modern technology, right? So it is still coming from the same institutions, which are run by the same enemy. So, like I was saying, it's ultimately, fundamentally, it's the same thing. It's the enemy deceiving humanity through moral confusion, telling them good is bad and bad is good. But the means for dispensing that misinformation have, been modernized with technology, of course. And so, problem nowadays is folks don't realize how much of what they're taking in as like supposed independent perspective or independent media really isn't. It's actually still part of the establishment pyramid, and so it's still dispensing misinformation to them. A lot of times it can be a good amount of truth, but then, you know, keeping the main lie, which supports the massive abuse, right? Whether that's statism or carnism, usually, you know, those being the top two in particular that are being maintained. But yeah, basically any entertainment, any, you know, programming, cable shows, movies, these all contain extremely toxic content, and you're better off disconnecting from it completely. There's a term you may have heard of called controlled opposition, and that's a real thing. Like, there's a lot of these actors that act like they're trying to, you know, look out for you and your community and family and give you the raw truth, but they're really just also known as gatekeepers, right? Because they keep out key information, key perspective, key knowledge, like I've been sharing with you here in this talk, even though they may go on about other things that are legit, you know, do have truth to them. They're ultimately going to lead you astray, and they're going to lead you into believing that in one way or another, you know, accepting abuse is sometimes okay, or when the so-called authorities do it, it's not actually abuse, right? That's the main deception and trick that the devil's been trying to pull on humanity since the beginning, because that's what keeps them out of paradise. That's what makes the world more hellish instead of heavenly, and that's what the enemy wants. So yeah, the parallel between how an individual narcissist acts in a relationship and, you know, what's going on with the powers that be really is a exact parallel. Like I said, it's just that personality type in a position of political power. So they just do the same things on a larger scale. And just like on the small scale personal relationship, they basically just make life worse for folks, you know. When you hear testimony of people getting out of these relationships, they just say, oh, they, you know, made my life hell, and they're driving me crazy, and just so miserable. That's actually what we're observing on the larger scale, right? They're making the world more hellish over time, because that's their modus operandi. That's their drive. They really have, you could say, gone to the dark side. People have a hard time accepting, I think, the simple fact that yes, there is this segment of the population that are actually evil, and yes, they would be interested in occupying the positions of power, you know, in the world. Like, that shouldn't, those 2 points shouldn't be too hard to accept. I think people doubt their ability to wreak the havoc they do in those positions of power. They think there's these checks and balances that keep them in check, but that's not actually how it works, and that's something you could understand if you actually just, again, could stick with the basic ethics, which is recognizing that the institution itself is based on abuse. So you're expecting an abusive institution to make its members less abusive. That's not logical, and that's not represented by all of history either. So the electric car issue, right? It's now 2023, and they've been talking as if it's just going to be inevitable that in the next several years or so, you know, combustion engines are just going to be phased out, and all cars are going to be electric. A lot of people don't see this as a threat to freedom. They just buy the propaganda they're being fed that this is just to make the world a greener place. Never mind all the environmental damage that goes into producing these vehicles and the batteries and the mining and the waste disposal and all that. Never mind the whole manufacturing side and how green that is. Putting that aside, let's just say it's electric vehicles are definitely better for the environment, better for human health. Even if that was true, it's still not something you should be eager at all to accept, because it gives them control over travel. Very simply because the electric cars are basically Wi-Fi enabled. They can be operated, or at the very least disabled, remotely. That's already been made clear with the electric vehicles already on the market. So why you would think giving people in positions of power, the ability to disable the means of independent transport for the entire population, like why you think that would be a good idea, would be equivalent to like why you would think letting them make medical decisions for you be a good idea. Like any non-idol worshipping sane person wouldn't think it's a good idea. You have to be an irrational idol worshiper to think that these are good ideas. And you have to believe still the programming that you were fed. I was talking about through mainstream media and entertainment. But of course, number one we could put on the list is, the state education system, which, especially during the formative years, right, up until you become 7 years old, the brain, child's mind is especially impressionable, right? So during those formative years especially, they are indoctrinated, they're programmed to believe that, the state is this benevolent institution worthy of respect, obedience, and worship, really. And, outlawing gas stoves, too, is just another means of control, right? So limiting your ability to travel. I mean, we saw that during the lockdowns. They said you couldn't fly unless you wore a medical device or injected yourself with whatever concoction, so they basically restricted everyone's travel to fly. But now they, as abusers do, they want to go further, and so they want to take away your ability to drive a vehicle independently. And of course, they'll say it's for safety, right? To reduce accidents, we need self-driving cars, and we need them to be remotely controlled, and so on and so forth. And to keep unsafe drivers off the road. It'll always be, pushed in the name of safety. That's been their most effective deception, right? Convincing people that, oh, the more we abusively control you, the safer you are. Right? It's just completely false. I'll just mention in brief here that probably number one example of the supposed safety that they provide that people cite, I think more people are realizing that police could be privately funded, that you could have private security companies. So they're not saying, oh, we need government for the police, but they do tend to say, oh, but we do need them for the military. So this is another one where not much careful thought has been given, right? So first of all, though, if someone doesn't want to fund an institution and their armed forces, saying that they have to and they're a bad person if they don't, doesn't hold up to scrutiny alone, right? So even before you get into like a debate of efficacy or like how much safer they're making the world or not, if someone doesn't want to fund a particular security service, whether that's a local security company or uh, a military, right? Does it make any ethical sense? Is it ethically legitimate to say, oh well, they're wrong for not wanting to fund that particular service, and say they want to just defend themselves, or they and their community members have a militia and they want to just take their chances on their own kind of thing. They think they're probably be okay defending themselves and they don't want to fund a more powerful force that could be turned against them, or commit atrocities in other parts of the world, and they don't want to have that on their conscience, right? Legitimate objections to being forced to pay for a security service, I'd say. But yet, people say, well, it's as if they think that the one violation or the one exception to the non-abuse principle is logistics. They're like, oh well, it just doesn't make logistical sense. We need to have this larger military in order to defend ourselves from these other larger militaries, right? Never mind that the military is run by a chain of command, right, with the politician at the top called the so-called commander-in-chief, right? And never mind that they tend to be corrupt and untrustworthy. So you're saying it's safer to put the most powerful weaponry in the hands of those that are least trustworthy. Like it really is as simple as that. I mean, I'm sure people would like to argue for days about how it's more complicated, but it's really not. It really just comes down to that. Like you're putting your trust once again into these historically abusive individuals who have their positions of power, their paycheck comes via extortion, via abuse, right? You're saying those are the ones that need to have the biggest guns, right? They need to have all the best and most powerful weaponry to keep us safe, right? It doesn't actually make sense. It would make more sense for them to have no weaponry at all. And yet you're saying, oh no, they should have the biggest weaponry, the most powerful, the most destructive. Why would you think that it's more rational to give the habitually abusive the biggest weapons and to take the weapons away from those that haven't been habitually abusive, and to disarm the population that has been nonviolent? It doesn't actually make any sense. And again, the only reason why people think it makes sense is just because of their programming, just because they've been indoctrinated with nonsense, right? Just to be naive idol worshippers that think abuse is sometimes acceptable. So again, I hope you found these points insightful, and feel free to share it with others, because it's definitely a censored perspective, especially if someone's talking about individual sovereignty and having access to homesteading land, water, and seed, which is the fundamental solution. That is the ultimate form of independence, which can break the cycle of abuse and end the funneling of wealth and power to these institutions of abuse, right? That would actually be the real social justice solution. So certainly not gonna, I haven't heard anyone else talking about it. So it's definitely censored or shadow banned. The other way you can see that this really is the solution, besides the ethics of it, right? Besides just recognizing, yeah, if I landed on an uninhabited island, people, the fair and just thing would be for us to, share whatever fresh water is available and whatever edible plants, and to give each other space and not rule over one another, give each other equal respect and, access to these natural resources and privacy and freedom, right? That common sense ethic points us to doing the same thing wherever you are on the earth. It doesn't have to be an uninhabited island, for the ethics and the truth about the natural resources needed for survival to remain the same. Of course, it remains the same wherever you are on earth. But the other way you can get confirmation on this being the actual solution is that the powers that be are pushing the complete opposite, right? So instead of living freely and naturally, they want everyone in these control grid cities, right? They want, instead of having a couple acres where you could have freedom and privacy, they want you in a city where you're under surveillance all the time, by cameras and cell phones and Wi-Fi routers and all the rest, satellites. They want complete surveillance 24/7, right? No privacy. So complete opposite of what the real solution offers, right? Instead of having your own space and connection with nature, right? They want to put you on top of one another and not have any space for independence and privacy and just peace and quiet, right? They want you to live in this artificial control grid versus a natural, free society, right? So that's just more confirmation to the fundamental ethics for you to take into consideration. All right, thanks for listening.